Thanks everyone for being here today. I will introduce our panelists. To my left is Yuka Sai, staff lawyer for the Public Interest Advocacy Center. And then to her left is Todd Hofley, Vice President of Policy and Communications at Beanfield. And then at the very end, we have Geoff White, Executive Director and General Counsel for the Competitive Network Operators of Canada. Now guys, I was told that we are streaming to many countries worldwide. So first I will get you guys to give a brief summary of what your respective organizations and businesses do. And while you do that, I will also ask you guys to define affordability and what exactly does affordability mean in the telecom industry. So I'll start with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm Yuka. I'm from the Public Interest Advocacy Center. We are a small but mighty consumer interest group that does a lot of advocacy work in the field of telecommunications, privacy, airlines, and other areas of consumer interest. And in terms of what I think affordability is, it's the ability for anyone to, for a fair price, obtain services that meets their daily needs without that task having to cut into other essential services. And with telecom becoming more and more of an essential service, affordability is also becoming a very important issue.
Hi, my name's Todd Hofley. I work for Beanfield. We own, operate, and build one of the largest independent fiber optic networks in Toronto, Montreal, and we are now expanding into Ottawa and Vancouver, so we're very excited about that. I think Yuka gave a great definition of affordability. It does change for each and every individual what that number is. So I would hesitate to put a number on that, but I certainly know Beanfield was founded upon the notion of equity and making sure that that was available in areas where it wasn't available before. So how we expand and how we think about affordability is incredibly important.
I'm here on behalf.
It's working.
I'm here on behalf of the Competitive Network Operators of Canada, which is an industry, not-for-profit industry association of approximately 30 smaller competitive telecommunications, communications service providers, home internet, home phone, TV, distribution services, etc. I'm formerly external counsel to the Public Interest Advocacy Center and represented a coalition of at least 4 civil society groups arguing for an affordability subsidy and a broadband funding mechanism so that the CRTC could lead the industry towards a more just universal access society. And I also sometimes teach communications law at the University of Ottawa, which I've done for 3 years. Affordability is exactly as my colleague Yuka has defined it, and it's something that we're failing at in Canada.
I want to talk, I'll start with you, Geoff, and we can work our way down the panel if you guys have stuff to add, about what does the current affordability landscape look like. We've seen, for example, a lot of acquisitions. Quebecor bought V Media, Bell got Distributel and eBox, Rogers may or may not get Shaw, we'll see in a few weeks. So what does that mean for affordability with all these acquisitions going on?
The landscape for affordability is as bleak as this crummy November day in Ottawa. It's not looking good, and that trend has been in place for at least several years right now. I am a lawyer, and I've reminded myself I want to go back to law a little bit today, and I think it's important. Like, the telecommunications sector is governed by a statute from Parliament, the Telecommunications Act. It was last updated wholesale in 1993. It sets out some very basic fundamental objectives for the CRTC, the regulator, in terms of responding to users' Canadian social and economic needs, which gets interpreted to mean affordability. There's a bunch of other policy objectives, but ultimately this system exists so that essential services are accessible and affordable for Canadians. Problem is, that act, the Telecommunications Act, leaves within it a lot of discretion to the chair and the commissioners, and I recognize we've got a former commissioner and a former chair of the CRTC in the audience.
Show
which
a
is
little respect.
excellent. I am showing respect. I have no criticism for the for that CRTC, that iteration of the CRTC. It's the current one, which I haven't been very shy about criticizing. We have, due to a series of political economy problems, seen a demise in competition that was once very promising for Canadians, at a point where smaller competitors had, there were lower barriers to entry, recognizing that the former incumbents had market power. There were a series of wholesale rules put in place to allow competitors to compete. But slowly but surely, under the tenure of Ian Scott, who's admitted he prefers large facility-based providers, has rendered a series of decisions or non-decisions that have made the smaller competitors vulnerable to acquisition. So 3 of my members, you mentioned eBox, was bought by Bell, VMedia, still a member of CNOC, bought by Videotron, and Distributel, once it meets through the regulatory hurdles, could be owned by Bell. And that's not the end of it. The small competitors, which are a vital safety valve and an easy way to discipline the larger incumbents by offering affordable choice, and also choice that responds to things like different linguistic communities, etc., they're going down in flames as we speak. And it's time for some action. So I say it looks weak, but that's not to say we don't have hope for the future, because it's one of the easiest solutions. And this would seem to me like to be a no-brainer from a political perspective in a rising cost of living crisis, to hit this pocketbook issue with some strong policy signals from the government. And to his credit, our current Minister of Industry has given the CRTC a very clear set of marching orders. And I'll digress there, and maybe we can talk about that a bit more later.
Yeah, so I agree with much of what you said. I think we're very different in terms of we are a facilities-based provider, and we have been doing the acquiring versus what Geoff is talking about. And I think there are definitely some concerns in that field. For us, the acquiring, we're trying to build that next national telecom carrier. And when we acquire companies, what we have done, which is the same thing we have done, and this might surprise everybody in the telecom industry, but we've done this throughout our history, is lower prices. That's all we've done in the history of our company, is lower prices. And when we acquire these new companies, the idea is to use their footprint to start building out another network of fiber. And then we in turn lower the prices that they would normally be charging. So we think that it can work in both directions. And we do think that the CRTC and the Competition Bureau as well also have a real role to play in trying to make sure that we have the set of tools that just allows us to compete on that even kind of playing field.
Could I just add, though, some of my members are also facilities-based. Distributel is a prime example. We had, like the smaller players, contrary to a very popular narrative of the former monopolies, the smaller players do invest in their communities. They do build facilities. The problem is, and it hasn't happened to Beanfield, and I have tremendous respect for your organization. The problem is, companies get to a certain scale, and eventually, and I'm not speaking on behalf of Distributel or VMedia, but they get to a certain scale, and then all of a sudden they're snapped up. And when they get snapped up, they start offering it. The owners, at least, that these former incumbents are acting in sort of ways that are predatory, etc. And I'll just end by saying this. Since 2019, when this wholesale access regime that the smaller competitors benefited from, when that started coming under pressure, prices consistently across the board for home internet and wireless, with some exceptions, have been increasing in Canada. So that's the answer to the affordability question. And that lays squarely at the feet of the CRTC.
Yeah, so the state of affordability in telecom, for a lot of people who might be watching, it may feel a little weird that we're talking about internet affordability when, issues of housing, food affordability is really putting the pressure on a lot of people. But the truth is, now you can't get very far without affordable internet to take you where you want to be economically, professionally, and socially. And it seems right now the discourse around broadband expansion has really focused on accessibility. And I think we know that accessibility doesn't guarantee affordability. And the market right now is great for high earners who are able to afford the fiber gigabit premium services at premium prices. But the reality is that for everyone else, a lot of people are getting priced out of basic services. So just to put a few numbers to what Geoff has said, I invite you to look at the data of the CRTC and the communications market reports. So let's see here. So in 2016, the national lowest reported average for 5010 service was $80.82. And then in 2019, which was when the wholesale rates were reversed, the average dipped to $66.71. And then, as you all know, last year the wholesale rates were reversed. And then now, the latest data from 2021 says that the average for 5010 service is $85.96. So that's $5 higher than it was in 2016. So a truly competitive market should be driving prices down over time and not up. So I guess the question we're all trying to answer is, how do we fix that? How do we give relief to consumers, and soon?
I want to quickly touch upon urban affordability, because when we hear about connectivity and access and affordability, we often think of rural, remote, Indigenous Canada. So Todd, I'll start with you. Can you talk about affordability in the urban areas? What are some of the price disparities you see in these different pockets in the cities you operate in?
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't to say that the discussion about the digital divide between rural and urban Canada isn't very real. It is very real, but the vast majority of Canadians do live in an urban centre. I've said this before, it's one of the things that really makes us quite distinct from the United States, where Americans only about 60% live in cities and about 40% are more rural. Sorry, I'll speak up. And that's probably the first time anybody's told me to speak up ever. I'm normally really the loudest person in the room. But in Canada, it's about half that. It's about 80% of us live in cities, and about 20% of us live in urban centers. And I think when we talk about the digital divide, there is this notion that as long as you live in a city, you have good connectivity, but that is just simply not the case. If you take Toronto being an example, yes, maybe if you live downtown in the core, which is the most expensive, one of the most expensive areas in the city to live, then you actually have some of the highest rates and the cheapest rates. We happen to build out in that area, and you can see where we are. You can literally go building by building, and if we're in the building, the price has dropped. But what you have are areas of Toronto where you're looking at, say, Northern Etobicoke or Scarborough, where this is where the vast majority of new immigrants, for example, to the country come. It's where there's much more affordable housing. And the stock of the housing also tends to be older, which makes it a little bit more difficult to get fiber into those homes. And what you see there is, it's almost like you've gone back in time 20 or 30 years. You see DSL connections with 2.5 or 5 megabits, maybe 10 at most, and you're paying $120 a month. Versus downtown Toronto, you're paying now $40 a month for a gigabit or a gigabit and a half. So this divide, we think, really needs to have a lot more attention paid on it. There are some really great initiatives out there. The Connect2Yo initiative is great. We've partnered with a number of people like Cisco to offer distributed Wi-Fi across some of the older towers in Toronto, and we've been trying to encourage the City of Toronto, when it looks at the retrofitting for environmental reasons of TCHC buildings, for example, that they also include retrofitting for access, so basically installing conduits, because right now, when it was a more monopolized environment than it is now, everything was free air behind walls. So in order to get in and actually compete in these buildings, there's just no pathway for any sort of competitor to get in there, unless it's through a wholesale regime, of course. And so we think that this type of thing needs a lot more discussion, and, because it affects the vast majority of people. When you look at the type of immigration numbers we're looking at over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years, 500,000 people coming in, the vast majority of which are going to settle in cities close to communities where they're going to feel comfortable. This is not going to get better, it's only going to get worse.
Does anyone have anything else they want to add?
So the digital divide is definitely very real. The problem with urban affordability and accessibility seems to be a combination of reliable internet, the issue of not having reliable internet, and paying much more than you would expect in an urban area for a lower quality of service. But there are also challenges in the urban areas as well. It is true that usually prices are a little bit lower and there are more competitors in urban areas competing for customers. And there are also municipal providers. For example, I can cite the National Capital Freenet Organization in Ottawa. They are a nonprofit internet provider who offers services at cost without a profit motive. But again, with the wholesale rates being what they are and the regulatory situation, it's really hard for those types of providers to grow and provide more affordable services for the people who need it. And they could be stronger and more present, but it's really difficult for them.
I'm going to be careful about what I say here because I know telecommunications scholar Ben Klass is in the audience and my phone's buzzing, so I feel like I'm being quoted or corrected maybe. I'm going to say this. Telecommunications is policy and regulation is primarily an economics problem. And it historically was an economics problem because these are expensive services to deploy. And so historically a monopoly would be granted over an area and the telecommunications company would then have that grant and would serve a given territory, a province, subject to the regulatory oversight of a regulator. And that regulator would set terms and conditions and would actually regulate rates and prevent that telecommunications company from engaging in discriminatory behavior and undue preferences, etc. Today, so that notwithstanding the fact that that legal concept exists, and in our act it calls for just and reasonable rates, and telecommunications companies not doing naughty things to their customers, the CRTC is largely, as a result of the act, stepped away from regulating all. And so in rural areas, the economics problem is one of it costs too much money to go out to serve a very low population basis. And that has been the experience of some of our members, like Coextro, just built 1 gig service to the Georginas on Lake Simcoe, First Nations there, whereas the incumbents just thought it was too small a project for them to invest in. When we get into the city, the economics problem is sort of a different one. There's already 1 network, maybe 2 networks that are built into a given area, and those 2 networks historically are the cable incumbent and the telephone company incumbent, and those generally result in you having a building, a home or a building that is sort of captive to that incumbent. And that's where the issue of wholesale access comes in and plays an important role, because right now there are 4 to 5 critical challenges and barriers blocking competitors from accessing individual homes and multi-dwelling units. There's lack of mandated access to the incumbent's fiber. There are loads of ongoing issues when it comes to accessing condo buildings and apartment buildings and things like that because of exclusivity deals. And then there are rules that don't require incumbents to share their in-building fiber, etc. So it becomes very expensive. There's this notion out there that facilities-based competition, building and overbuilding cities to connect homes is the only way to do telecom in Canada, and I really think that notion needs to be challenged. That notion seems to have been well accepted by the outgoing chair of the CRTC, but just several years ago, it was well understood that the barriers to entry in this market are so high that you have to allow wholesale access and access to all, like the fiber as well, so that the competitors can offer an affordable choice to the incumbents.
Well, speaking of MDU access, I was going to get to this later, but it's a good segue. Todd, I know at last week's conference we talked about these exclusivity deals in condos. Could you want to touch a bit upon that, and what are some of the barriers you're facing with that?
Yeah, absolutely. We see this as increasingly something we're worried about. There are two things maybe I'll discuss. The first thing has to do with the notion of, as Geoff said, these exclusivity deals, what we call bulk deals, whereby an incumbent will speak to a developer ahead of a development being completed. So say you're building a 400-unit condominium tower, and the developer will approach the incumbents who have very deep pockets and say, hey, would you like to be the exclusive thing? Sign a contract, we'll bake it into the declaration so it becomes part of the condominium fees for the people who live there. Give us, X amount of dollars per unit, and as these condominium buildings get bigger and bigger, these numbers get bigger and bigger. If you're paying $250 a unit for a 700-unit condominium building, you're looking at $250,000 up front. And when you're looking at 40 of those across, the city a year, all of a sudden it adds up. And then that building only has one network built into it. So there are a number of problems when it comes to affordability, but also resiliency. As we witnessed this past summer, if you happen to be in a building that was affected by the Rogers outage, the whole community went down. And I come from a community of condominiums in Liberty Village, where actually Beanfield is based. I am still the president of a condominium corporation. And we often think of buildings, we talk about, oh, this is a condo building, and we think of it as a singular notion. But we really need to start changing the conversation. Every floor on a building is the same as a street. And every condo building is about the size of a small town. You're looking at somewhere between 400 to 5,000 people who live in these condominiums. And they are being dictated to, in a completely undemocratic manner by the developer and whichever company gets the bulk deal, who they're allowed to have business dealings with. And so they're locked in, they have no choice, there is no end user choice, which is supposed to be one of the tenets that is in a competitive market. But then again, when it comes to the resiliency factor, when we talk about the Rogers outage, that whole building community went down completely, and increasingly those condominiums are also relying on water sensors. Their elevator phones went down. Everything went down for that. And so all of a sudden you're just completely dark, which is quite dangerous from a safety perspective. So we would really like to see some clarity given, because the access, yes, we might be able to get access, but we can't compete when the market's gone. There's no market there. Why would somebody build into a building when you can't sell to anybody in that building? There's an enormous build-in cost for this, and it also affects wholesalers as well trying to get into that building, because there's no market. The market's gone for up to 5 years in some of these contracts. And we hear often from people who are in these buildings saying, I want to not do this, but I can't double pay for my internet access. So we would love to see some clarity and some really stringent rules about no end user choice has to be guaranteed. These bulk deals need to be completely disallowed. And on the commercial side of things, because I know we have been speaking a lot today about residential internet access, which is really important. But on the commercial side of things, we also see a lot of riser management companies and fees, which keep adding on significant costs to the telcos that we have to pass on to the consumer. In a lot of cases, that means that it becomes completely unaffordable for them and for us, which means, again, there's a lack of competition in the building because we can't even get in, because all of a sudden we're being slapped with a $10,000 fee, which means that, if that was one thing, we spoke, myself and our CEO, Dan Armstrong, spoke last week at the Canadian Telecom Summit, and that was one thing to have a $4,000 fee when you were charging $3,000 or $4,000 a month for these services 20 years ago. But that same service 20 years ago is now $500 a month. So the fee is completely disassociated with the reality that we're facing in terms of the fees that we can charge. So we would love to see some direction and clarity as well, not only about access, but about how these fees are managed and the fact that they're supposed to be not profit generating. They're supposed to be just for cost only.
Yuka, I know one thing you would like to see is for the government to expand its Connecting Families. For those of you who don't know, well, this was an initiative that started in 2018, I believe, but in April of this year, the government announced it came to an agreement with 14 internet service providers to make high-speed internet available for $20 a month to low-income families and seniors. So do you think we need to go bolder?
Absolutely. So just to elaborate on that, the Connecting Families program is a government program that enables low-income families and seniors now to obtain a low-cost internet from a participating ISP. So what that means is there's also a lot of people who are not eligible for the program. So low-income individuals who don't have children and who are not seniors are not eligible. And the program is also dependent on the voluntary participation of ISPs who are willing and able to subsidize the heavily discounted service. So there are definitely gaps in the program, and it's good to see that it's gradually expanding, but in truth, it's not really a true affordability subsidy since there are so many gaps in the program and it's not universally accessible to everyone. If you want to take a look at what a true subsidy might look like, you could look to the FCC's Lifeline program in the US, which is a portable discount that anyone can apply to an ISP service. Eligibility is solely based on whether you're already part of an assistance program. So something like that would be really helpful in Canada so that everyone has a chance who needs it to obtain more affordable internet.
I gotta say, the Connecting Families initiative is what's half of a half measure. It's like a quarter measure, in the sense that it's got limited applicability. It locks you into your service provider. If you happen to live in an area where you're with you have access to one of the 14 participating service providers, it locks you into that service provider, so you have no choice. So you don't have the dignity of actually choosing a service provider or comparing service providers based on the reputation of customer service. And when I was external counsel for the Public Interest Advocacy Center, we argued for a Lifeline-like service. And the CRTC's answer at the time, or at least the impression I got from some of the commissioners at the time was, whoa, affordability, that's a bigger problem with the economy. Indeed it is, but the Telecommunications Act talks about the CRTC regulating in a way that responds to social and economic needs of users. So I would argue, if I were still acting for PIAC, which I'm not, I'm arguing for competitors who are part of the solution, I would say that is well within the CRTC's mandate to implement, and is a quick and easy way to restore the trust in an institution that, as I argued in the Globe and Mail in June of last year, is failing Canadians.
I would agree the Connecting Families program is a really great attempt, and the notion is absolutely fabulous. We are a signatory to it, although we have found the burden of getting it up and running, the interaction of the API with the interface to be very difficult technologically, especially as a smaller company, in order to make sure that all of our customer experience analysts understand what's happening in the process, the vetting process, etc. I love the idea of what you both just mentioned. That sounds great, so we should have a discussion about that. But I know the issue and the limitations to the Connecting Families program is something that we've actually considered. So we are in the process of creating our own what we call Fair Connection program, which deals with this and is only about low income. The challenge we have found, though, is finding an appropriate partner who can vet who is part of that while respecting privacy rules and all this kind of stuff. It gets quite detailed. Our intention in the Connecting Families program was to, and we've stated this to them, was to offer significantly more bandwidth than is necessary. We think that 1050 is, quite frankly, not equitable. And it's much more doable. The costs of these things do decrease over the course of time. It's very expensive to build a new fiber network. There's absolutely no doubt about that, and there are significant cost increases there. But the cost for how many megabits you're transferring over has dropped significantly. So for us, for example, we only have one plan, internet plan for residential customers. That's it, because we believed in equity. It's $50 a month and it's a gigabit, symmetrical, up and down, no throttling, etc. And we were planning to offer that plan at the $20 for connecting families, because we wanted to up the bar. We think we can do more, and we think we can do better.
I will also point out, in terms of the logistics of implementing a broader eligibility mechanism, there are already programs like this in Canada with respect to utilities and energy services, which works a lot like how the Lifeline program works, where if you're already part of an assistance program like GIS, then you can apply to get that discounted service.
Can I just add one thing really quickly? I think Todd says we should have that conversation, and it's awesome. Thanks to the Internet Society, we are having that conversation. This is a wonderful event. You know who's not having this conversation though? The CRTC. The CRTC has been nothing but opaque and very slow in the past couple of years. This should be job number one of the CRTC: affordable access to telecommunication service. That's it, that's all. Everything else, Canada's anti-spam legislation enforcement, botnet level, great, important social measures, but if we can't get job number one right, I question whether or not we can get that other stuff right, let alone the stuff about broadcasting and forcing Facebook to negotiate with the media, all sorts of things on the horizon that are interesting and I understand are very important to the government, but surely internet affordability has to be a priority. It seems to be with Minister Champagne's policy direction to the CRTC, but we've got to get that right. And I'll just go back to that hearing when I was before the commission saying, like, this is real. We did surveys of people sacrificing medicine and clothing and food so they could afford their home internet bill. I mean, that was years ago. It's worse now. Prices have gone up. Now we're in an inflationary crisis as well. But at the time, the incumbents were arguing, market forces will take care of it. Well, let me tell you what happens with market forces right now. First of all, the system's been gamed to death in the face of a regulator who seems apathetic. And secondly, the once vibrant promise of hope for Canadians in the form of competition has been just suffocated. And so it's going to get a lot worse, and I'm really crossing my fingers that the next CRTC chair reads that policy direction and gets the message, and job number one is to focus on this issue so we can have that discussion, not just this group of seemingly like-minded people, but we can bring the incumbents to the table and we can see that the regulator's paying attention to it.
Yuka, I know you wanted to touch upon some other targeted and systemic measures at the retail and wholesale level that are needed to fix Canada's affordability problem. So I'll let you take that away. I know one thing you mentioned was advertising.
Yeah, so in terms of all the pieces that need to fall into place to build a sustainable affordability strategy, the way that internet service providers advertise internet service is probably a really big one. So that means that instead of advertising services in terms of solely an up to speed limit, it would be really great for consumers to be able to look at an internet ad and see the typical tested range of speeds that a consumer can expect during peak periods of use. And PIAC recently published a research report looking at this very issue, and we found that Australia and the UK did just this. They went through consultations and they implemented these very specific rules for how internet service should be advertised, and now consumers in those places, they have more realistic, reliable expectations for the kind of service that they will be receiving, and fair recourse if those expectations are not met. So this was a study that looked at what happened in the last 10 years in this area. We did a study looking at this 10 years ago, and this was our updating study. And what we found that in Canada, things really haven't changed. So I think it's important that businesses, ISPs, are held accountable to the services that they advertise. And in our report, we go into some of the academic perspectives on this issue. For example, a paper by Catherine Middleton and Reza Rajabian, they really made the argument that innovation is stifled when internet service isn't advertised in a regulated, specific, reliable way. If everybody is advertising their services as an up-to speed, then how can you rely on an evaluation or comparison of which one provides the better service?
Do you guys have anything you want to add?
The rates that competitors pay for wholesale access are too high. What the competitors have access to is inappropriate in the sense that we lack access to fiber to the home. Those are two, and third, there's a litany of issues in terms of competitors accessing multi-dwelling units. Those are three sort of practical, thorny issues facing competitors right now. But I started by saying I wanted to go back to the law for a bit, and I'll remind everyone, a couple of years ago, the government appointed this panel of wise persons to study our Telecommunications Act, Broadcasting Act, Radio Communication Act, make recommendations. I had the pleasure of advising the panel. It came out with a report in June of 2020, loads of great recommendations in terms of how to overhaul and modernize our legislative framework. And I'll leave you with two ideas that I think if those were taken up, we'd see more action, even in the face of a regulator who appeared to not want to do their job. Item number one, and this is a procedural thing, but it's an important thing, and they do this in the UK. They impose upon the regulator a duty to publish and meet timelines. Under the current way things are done, applications get filed with the CRTC, consultations happen, and then you phone up for an answer in terms of what's happening. Oh, we can't talk about any of our active files. We're currently looking at it. Years are going by with the emergency applications. The CRTC is currently long overdue on a series of very impactful decisions, etc. So number one, to improve the way the regulator works, which is what the industry minister has basically told the CRTC to do, get your act in order and live up to some timeliness standards to actually do your job and push out decisions. Point number two, under the Telecom Act, I talked about how there's still a provision that calls for just and reasonable rates, and less related because you found, as a quasi-judicial tribunal, that to deregulate from rates, there would be sufficient competition to protect end users. Well, the Legislative Review Panel said, that's not good enough. You actually have to justify on a continued basis your deregulation. And I suspect that if the CRTC took a closer look at the state of retail competition, we would find a lot of trouble there, worthy of re-regulation. If we are facing the great remonopolization in Canadian telecom right now, the regulator has to go back to monopoly-like regulation. If Shaw falls to Rogers, TELUS falls to Bell, we're going to be back to two regional monopolies, and monopoly-like regulation will be called for.
I would like to speak, actually, so I couldn't agree more with you, Geoff, in terms of encouraging the regulator to significantly speed up or completely alter the way that it makes decisions. Right now, the status quo is being used to ensure an anti-competitive playing field. And it's got to stop. When you try to get into a building, people want their internet service now. So when we're being hampered by someone who's like, pay up $10,000 or take off, we need a decision upon that in a week. We need the regulator to step up and go, no, this access is guaranteed as of right under the Act, and you have to follow the rules. That's all we're asking for. But as it stands right now, an incumbent who's already in the building can pay that amount or even more, which sets up a precedent. But then it's going to take us months or possibly years to actually have that case or that cause, that thing we brought before the CRTC heard. So we need a much faster mechanism to ensure this. From what you were talking about in terms of up to, we also use the terms up to, but one of the reasons has to do with the different way that people use the internet. And I'm not saying this to excuse it in any way, shape, or form, and agree with the minimum speed guarantee. I think that'd be wonderful. But a lot of people use their internet at home now primarily through Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi has limitations in that speed. So when you plug in the Ethernet port, yeah, you should get that 1 gigabit. But I think a lot of the reasons some people use the term up to is because through the Wi-Fi you're never going to get that kind of throughput. You will get, again, depending upon the provider, but for us you'll probably get somewhere between 700 and 800 megabits a second download on Wi-Fi 6, which is more than enough for almost anybody to do anything with. But we do see massive, I would say, it's disingenuous the way that it's presented, these speeds, for example. We're seeing them now, you can see billboards all over downtown Toronto where it's like, 2.5 gigabits a second. But when you go down into the fine print of the actual contract, you're never going to get that 2.5 gigabits a second. In fact, our 1 gigabit package, if we use the same measurement, is 2.5 gigs. So we would love to see that type of oversight increase significantly, so that, this all goes down to trust, and Canadians don't have a lot of trust right now in their telecommunications providers. And it's really sad because it has become like water for all of us. This is absolutely something that is essential for us to participate in our world. It's like clean drinking water, it's like a sewage system, it's like having power and electricity in our homes. You have to have this in order to survive. And it's just not being given the attention and the proper sophisticated tools in order to have a really thriving industry.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I absolutely agree. There are a lot of intricacies and technicalities to how internet works within the home. And I think the problem that we have here, and that have been actually addressed in Australia and in the UK, is presenting information in the ads and in the on the website in a way that ensures that the consumers have an accurate expectation of how their internet is supposed to work. So if Wi-Fi is going to be a factor in the speeds that the customer can expect when they use the internet, then that should be upfront and explained in plain language in the actual advertisement. And they should be able to compare different tiers of plans, like within a company and between companies as well. So there's a whole bunch of standards that could be hashed out on this.
I do want to leave time for Q&A, so just very quickly, because the government's target was for affordability was to reduce bills by 25%. It says it met that target. Does it need, what do you think about that target? Does it need a new one?
Yes. So the issue with the 25% decrease goal that the government has set, if you look at the actual studies and the results on that, yes, on the surface it does seem like the 25% decrease has happened, but often I think the problem comes down to the methodology, and I dare say maybe a little bit of cherry picking on the types of plans that they look at in measuring the decrease or increase of plan prices. So sometimes the government only looks at the promotional plans, which are temporary and they don't last forever. Sometimes they also look at only the mid-tier plans, which are fine, but there are consumers that depend on the lower tier, more affordable plans. So I think there has to be more attention paid to the methodology in these studies.
Yeah, I used to pay $55 for 4 gigs with Videotron. Now I pay the same for 2 gigs. So
Canadians are going to continue paying more for less unless the regulator takes a stronger position against the lack of competition and anti-competitive conduct. I encourage you to follow @BenClass. He's over there. He tweets regularly about these things and recently was tweeting about we're talking about in the context of the Rogers Shaw merger and how Videotron might be the knight in shining armor to save Freedom Mobile. Look, Ben was looking at the pricing of Videotron in Quebec and then comparing it to other service providers, and I think that you were demonstrating that in fact Videotron's actually pricing isn't always comparatively favorable. This 25% expectation was wireless only, and when it comes to wireless prices, the CRTC's own data shows that it's been increasing. Internationally, we fared embarrassingly poorly against our peer countries. We don't have a target yet for home internet, and home internet really, internet is an important point for you now. However, home internet's really, we talked about working from home and all the access that's happening and the consumption and participation in society that's happening at home. So we've got to be more ambitious on that side as well. I call the 25% price reduction window dressing, and of course, when you don't set a firm target, the incumbents can play games with it, and that's what's been done.
There's also something to be said for the notion of promotional rates that really kind of grinds my gears. In turn, a promotional rate, so often when you're talking about getting a really great rate, it's incumbent upon you, the consumer, to A, have an hour and a half of time and the language skills and the negotiation skills that are necessary to find, argue, talk, get another number for a retention department, which, if you kind of think about it, is kind of awful to have in the first place. It means that you aren't as valuable as another customer at the exact same company. They want to, because you have the time and the accessibility. When we're talking about digital equity, the previous panel, when we're talking about digital equity, this is a huge difference between somebody where, say English is your first language or whatever, in that you don't have, or you've got to hold down 3 part-time jobs for minimum wage in order to feed your family. You don't have the time to sit down with a call center and fight for a rate that your next door neighbor can call and get. It's fundamentally unfair. And we think that there needs to be a lot more light shone on that. That's the right word, shown on that. Because we think, again, when it comes to affordability, who is it that has the time? It's the people who make the most money in the places, who speak the language and have the advantages already. So all it does is exacerbate what is already an extremely problematic inequity.
All right, we'll wrap it up there and go to Q&A. Any questions? Yeah.
It's a bit quiet. Okay, there we are.
You got to get in real close. I think later on.
Hi, I work with the communications team here, but I also worked about 5 years for Bell as a sales associate. I worked for T-Booth for a few years. That's owned like 50-50 Bell and Rogers as a sales associate. So I've seen these prices jump, and I like what you all said about advertising and trust. And us as sales associates never had trust in our customers because the prices kept changing. No one knows these days that like every 3 months the prices drop at the end of each quarter by like $40, and these are big changes in pricing. And even in the same mall, you could walk down to another kiosk and get the exact same phone, the exact same plan, with the exact same provider for $20 cheaper, you know what I mean? I just want to know how these things can be regulated, if it can be. Advertising is huge, and people don't know that these prices are changing literally daily by like drastic changes. So, that's my question.
Who wants to take that one?
I think the solution for that is really multifaceted. The advertising issue is definitely a big one. And honestly, I don't envy the position of the salespeople of these companies. They're under huge pressures to make a quota or whatever requirement that the sales team requires of them. And often there's just not enough training to equip them to inform customers about the services that they're selling. And the CRTC conducted a study on misleading and aggressive sales practices a few years back, and that emerged as a really big issue, especially for vulnerable customers, like seniors who really don't have the ability to advocate for themselves at a level of technical savvy, and just advocate for themselves at a level where they can obtain the services that they need. So there's monitoring measures, there's rules that the CCTS, the CRTC, the Competition Bureau can together implement to make sure that customers are protected.
One of the more, kind of going to your thing, your comments, is that one of the more insidious things I've seen is something I experienced even where I live, is the notion of a promotional discount. So it's not like you even get a promotional rate, you get a promotional discount. You get like $25 off your service, and that's guaranteed. But the service keeps going up in price. So then you have to so yeah, you have, whatever, a 24-month discount, but your price is still going up. So it's really, really problematic in terms of, and it's just so disingenuous, and it just furthers the distrust. And even, as you said, if you're an employee of the companies, that must be very frustrating.
Any other questions? Maybe we'll have both of you guys ask her questions, and then we could just answer.
I think it's on. Yeah, hi. I just was wondering how you guys account for the flanker brands in all of this conversation, the kudos and the chatters of the marketplace, and, does that dynamic change anything, or is it all the same?
And then we'll take your question.
Thanks. Super uninformed question about hardware. Like a few years ago, I remember countries talking about dig once legislation. Anytime you put a hole in the ground, you were going to put fiber down as a public utility. Now it seems like lower Earth orbit is potentially going to be disrupting the space. To what extent is hardware innovation going to change all the dynamic that you've been describing?
I can start with a comment on the flanker brand. So obviously the flanker brand services are usually more affordable to people, and therefore for some people that might be the only option for service. But the problem is sometimes the quality of service you get with flanker brands is not up to par with those of the premium brands. So a very specific example I can think of is, I think one of the smaller flanker brands, you can only pay for service with a credit card. And obviously that's going to become a problem with this new credit card surcharge coming in. So, that's also another affordability problem for people who only have the option of paying by credit card.
Flanker brands and their approach to pricing is quite a problem. I'll suggest to you that the presence of flanker brands owned by the large incumbents offering prices in the retail market that are lower than the regulated wholesale rate is a problem. I suspect that I would hope that the Competition Bureau is interested in it from a predatory pricing perspective. It certainly shows that there's a problem with the CRTC's wholesale rates, the fact that a flanker of an incumbent can offer sub-wholesale tariff rate retail rates. Intuitively, that doesn't make any sense. And as Canadians run out of choice, we've seen already since 2019 that the prices for wireless, wireline, et cetera, have been increasing. And as Canadians run out of choice, run out of doors to knock on in terms of competitors, those prices will continue to go up. I think those are a facade. I think just like some of the regulatory measures taken by the CRTC, and to a lesser extent the government, have been window dressing and have avoided the hard yet easy work that the CRTC ought to be doing with the right political will to go back to ensuring affordable access for all Canadians. That's core to the mandate, and I think we've lost sight of that, and I think that's due to lack of political will.
Perhaps I can address the hardware question. The technology is changing constantly and at an increasing pace. This is the same across society. So it's kind of difficult to really look 2, 3, 4 years out. We are very unique. Beanfield is very unique. There's a redundant term, isn't it? Beanfield is unique in that we actually have, we own and operate and we build all our fiber ourselves. We have an outside plant versus the vast majority of telcos contract out all the construction of their networks. We actually build our own networks. And we've decided that investing in that makes the most sense in order to lower our cost. We would love to see, and this doesn't really address the hardware section because I'm not sure there's anything coming that's going to significantly change the need for fiber in the ground or along telephone poles, hopefully in the ground more, because it's, you know, as we found out on the East Coast recently, it's very problematic when it's in the air. You know, as we need to invest in that. Those costs aren't going down. Little elements of those costs aren't going down, but certain labor costs aren't going down. And what we would love to see happen a lot more is collaboration in urban centers in terms of these builds. Because you have a lot of disruption when you're constantly tearing up a street, you're restoring a street 3 and 4 times. It adds up over and over and over, but we don't necessarily have the best collaboration in the urban centers in order to ensure that when a new infrastructure project, say you're putting in a whole new sewer line, you know, we keep, our mantra is conduits, conduits, conduits. When the ground is open, stick conduits in there. They cost pennies a foot, and they give you so many options. Like when you're building a home, put in those conduits in your walls so that you can, you know, put electricity wherever you want, or an Ethernet line wherever you want, or speaker wire wherever you want. So that's really the way we're kind of going forward with that.
Any other questions? Cool. Well, thank you so much.